Okay, this last hand we have ace king, folds around, hero opens, faces a 3-bet, and hero decides to go for a 4-bet. So in this situation, whether or not I like the 4-bet is 100% up for debate and very, very dependent on whose stock markets is. So if stock market is a tighter guy who only really 3-bets nuttish hands, queens plus ace king, or even tighter than that, I really don't love giving his 3-bet action at all. I'm not going to flat, I'm not going to go for the 4-bet, just probably going to fold and hate life. Whereas if he starts 3-betting more aggressively than that, particularly really aggressive, then I'm much more apt to go for the 4-bet just like Hero did, play ace king a little bit faster, totally happy with that. Now, Hero's size is kind of interesting because if Hero does decide to go for this size, and gets action, whether he faces the shove or gets a call, he's pretty much priced in. Because if he decides to go for the 4-bet and gets called, we have a 1 SPR pot. And if he had shoved, obviously we're going to be getting a decent price, we're going to call that as well. And again, you should always have that plan before you go for a 4 or 5-bet with a hand like ace king. Know whether or not you're going to call that shove and think about that before you even make the aggressive play in the first place. But as played, once we do get called, we end up going here and we end up missing the board. We know this is going to happen roughly 2/3 of the time. It's not the most rare occurrence in the world by any stretch, and Hero decides to go for a bet. So what I want to talk about real quick is just how to look at a situation like this so you know how to look at small SPR pots a little bit better. And for those of you that don't know, SPR is just stack to pot ratio. It's essentially how many times the size of the pot you have left in the effective stack, and the effective stack is 296. The pot size is 297, so it's almost exactly a 1 SPR pot. So we can very easily proof this, and what we're really proofing is should we commit on this flop or not, because whether we shove or whether we bet something like $1.75, if he shoves, we're going to be getting a sick price and we're going to call. However, I'm going to try to convince Hero to make a shove here next time instead of just going for this $1.75 bet, and here's why. So mathematically, we can proof this using a fold equity calculator and also using Poker Stove and figure out some basic stuff. So in this hand, we are going to be effectively shoving 296, pot size is 297, need our estimated equity. So this is the equity that he would 3-bet, he would call our 4-bet, and he would call our shove with. So let's proof that. Let's say he would do that with jacks, aces, kings, queens. Let's give him 10s, and we'll just go with that for the moment. Pretty worst case scenario range if we think about it. 16, submit it. And notice here that we need some folds for this to be break even. But can we really expect those folds? Well, if he were going to call pre-flop with a range like this, would he also have ace king? Would he have any ace queen? Would he also possibly have even weaker pairs than that? So if we think that he has something like 10s, I'm usually going to assume that there's either some sort of ace king or ace queen in there as well. I think people tend to kind of pair a pocket 10s in a range with something like an ace king or ace queen. And thus, if we look at that, we notice that there's a decent amount of high card. Now, obviously, we have the issue in the sense that we block a lot of that, being that we have ace king. But if it were ace queen instead, notice that that's going to influence it. Notice that's where our folds are coming from. We think he has roughly 36% ace high. We need at least 34% folds for this to be break even. Totally on board with that. Now, what if his range is a little bit different? What if instead of it being like that, what if he would also call or shove with ace king and ace queen suited? Let's just assume that for a moment. Submit it. Notice that we get the huge equity boost. So now if we run the same stuff, so we go back to 296, we go back to 297, estimated equity of 31, submit, and now all of a sudden you notice that we're looking pretty good. So if he can have something like even just one or a couple of rare combos of, say, like an ace 10 or king queen, that sort of thing, then all of a sudden it's not too difficult to see this is going to be break even. I'm sorry, it's going to be profitable above break even. Now, Hero did decide to go for $1.75, and the big reason why I don't like that, and I'd rather shove this myself instead, is simply because I want to eliminate the possibility of him possibly shoving this. Obviously, I'm going to call the shove, but if I can eliminate that option, I make his options 50, he can only do two things. He can either call it or he can fold it. Whereas if I bet this, he has a third option of being able to shove himself. And I don't want him to really feel ballsy. I'm totally okay if he just decides to fold a hand that has equity. If he folds out his equity, I'm okay with that. So I would rather go for the shove myself. I'm expecting this to be long run profitable. As played, here does end up facing the shove, does end up improving, which makes life a little bit easier. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if stock markets is getting here with ace king, ace queen, pocket sixes, he's really the one that's making the mistake by putting himself in a 1 SPR pot like that with a hand like that. So Hero's line looks totally fine. Pre-flop looks good. The flop idea looks good. I would just rather shove it myself. And as played, obviously try to run it out if you do end up getting called, because you're most likely going to be behind most of the time that happens. But again, you always have equity in those times unless he has exactly pocket jacks. So ultimately, again, big inflection point was the 4-bet size, the 4-bet idea, and then also the flop c-bet and understanding, again, why we're going to be shoving that, and even more so if he's a fishy opponent that can have things like ace-queen, king-queen, that sort of thing. I mean, yes, that also means he could have some ace-jack, but by the same token, I'm expecting that in the long run, he's making huge mistakes and we're just going to crush him in this spot.